Just a fabulous weekend. We've got many people here who are interested in preserving and keeping the Gullah culture alive. So thank you all so much for coming. I'm Ruben Conti from the Heritage Library and also a member of Mitchellville's board. It's been a great weekend. I'm glad everybody came together and that Dr. Bunch came down here, so that spurred us all to get together once again, and we're hoping that we will continue to work together in a consortium that we're trying to put together that will eventually end up promoting Beaufort County as the focal point and epicenter of the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. So once again, thanks everybody for coming.
Come on up, Dr. Campbell. No introduction is needed. You're welcome.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Joyce, when you're at a university, you don't do such a thing as saying I'm the historian.
Yes, you are.
A lot of people here more qualified than I am to be a historian.
True.
It's something like, I heard the story, Lonnie, about the guy who died and went to heaven. And he, sitting around with the Lord, and said, he was asked what was the greatest experience ever on earth. He had experienced the Johnstown flood. And he thought that was the greatest flood. He got up to explain about the Johnstown flood, and somebody grabbed his coattail and said, I think you ought to know Brother Noah is in the audience. So there are a lot of people in the audience that are more qualified than me to talk about history. But this is a special night. We have with us a very distinguished guest. How many of you were at a February meeting in Hilton Head at the Coastal Discovery Museum last year? At that meeting, you know, we had decided that we were going to go forth and form a consortium of Beaufort County Gullah purveyors. That's a big word, meaning people who really try to preserve and portray the Gullah culture. And nobody is more prominent at that than Beaufort County people. Ron Davis, Anita Prather, Scott Gibbs, Queen Quet, Louise Cohen, Heritage Library, Coastal Discovery Museum, Penn Center. All those people do something with Gullah. I mean, they've been doing it for years. And so we said, why not, I just heard a term this afternoon from my good friend Maggie, why not create an ambience for collaboration? Ambience for collaboration or dialogue. And that's what we've been trying to do. And one of the persons who really motivated us to do that is a visitor to the island about 3 years ago, a lady named Maggie Burton. And Maggie was with us that night. And Maggie said, it's a great idea, and I think such an idea could work well with the corridor. The corridor could also then, you know, connect with the National Museum of African American History and Culture. One of the persons who would be interested in making that connection is the man who heads that effort up, Lonnie Bunch. And you know, I could have Lonnie Bunch come for a visit. She promised tonight. And tonight we have Lonnie Bunch to come for a visit. And we still are proceeding with organizing that consortium. And I hope this will inspire us and motivate us to even do it quicker. The corridor would be happy, and Beaufort County would be happy, and I think the National Museum would be happy. So, that's all I have to say. I welcome you, I thank you for coming, and hopefully tonight when we hear all the proceedings and comments, we will leave there with the spirit of organizing a consortium for an ambience of dialogue and collaboration.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I was told they wanted me to do a little preamble, and then we'll actually do the serious conversation. So let me begin by telling you a story. Early in my career at the Smithsonian, I was asked to curate an exhibition on the history of the 19th century. And part of that was looking at the story of enslavement. So I decided, rather than tell the broad story of slavery, that I would find a single plantation to focus on, to tell the story through that lens. So I visited plantations all around the country. I spent weeks looking at cotton plantations in Alabama, days wrestling with sugar plantations in Louisiana. I spent a lot of time on tobacco plantations in North Carolina and Virginia. And then I was taken to an amazing place, the Friendfield Rice Plantation on the old Waccamaw Neck above Georgetown, South Carolina. And I decided I would focus on that, because there, as I turned the corner, were 7 slave cabins from the 1840s still standing. And standing next to one of them was a man named Mr. Johnson. He was 93 years old, and he had lived in that cabin with his enslaved grandmother. So for a historian, this is the Holy Grail. Somebody that could tell you what it was like. And Mr. Johnson was amazing. He took me to the front of the cabin, and he talked about how his grandmother and the enslaved folks used that broom to do that hard sweep, to make the ground so hard there'd be no grass, no vermin. He took me to the side and he talked for a half hour about how children watched the chimney to make sure it didn't catch on fire or fall over. We went to the back and he got rolling. He was talking about how the enslaved population grew crops to supplement what the master gave them. And then we went to the foreside, or rather, I went to the foreside. Mr. Johnson didn't come. I said, Mr. Johnson, come on over here. He said, son, I'm not going over there. Now, I'm a young scholar, thinking I'm about to find something brilliant. I said, Mr. Johnson, please. I came all the way from D.C., help me out, tell me what's over here. He said, son, I'm not going over there because there's nothing but rattlesnakes over there. Now, after I stopped running, I said to Mr. Johnson, why didn't you tell me? And he said, son, people used to remember, now they forget. If you are a historian, you know what your job is? Your job is to help people remember not just what they want, but what they need. And in some ways, the struggle to build an African American museum is really shaped by that issue. How do you help people see what they need, not just what they want? And 9 years ago, I came back to the Smithsonian. I'm a lifer. I met my wife at the Smithsonian. My kids went to school at the Smithsonian. So I'm a lifer. So I came back from Chicago. And 9 years ago, we began this endeavor with a staff of 2. We had no location for the museum. We had not a single artifact raised. And we knew that we were going to have to raise an awful lot of money, but we had not a penny in the bank. And now, 9 years later, because of the support of so many people, we now have the best location in America, next to the Washington Monument, within the shadow of the White House. We have a gifted architect who is from the UK, a black Brit, who has designed a beautiful building. We also have now a staff of 150 people working to birth this museum. And from no collections, we've gone to now having 35,000 artifacts that will help people understand the richness of this story. But we've also done something that was essential. We have now raised $440 million in order to build this museum. So, and I'm not going to lie and tell you that was easy. But now we are on the verge of opening a national museum in less than 2 years. So the dream of many generations is just around the corner. But that dream is only going to become real because of the work of many of you in this room. I am like many of the people who just admire and love Emory Campbell and what we've learned from him over the years and the work that all of you have done. So the reality is this museum will happen, but it'll only happen because the work of thousands of individuals who care about history, who care about the African American experience, who care about America, have led the way. And all I'm simply doing is standing on the shoulders of pioneers like Emory. So I just wanted to let you know that this is the moment This is a moment when we're close to fulfilling this dream. It's a moment that needs a lot of support from people around the country. But it's a moment where pretty soon we can sit back and be proud to say that once this museum opens, as long as there's an America, there's a chance to tell this story, to learn this history, to be made better by the African American experience. Thank you.
I think it'd be worth our while to hear Lonnie explain how he became an historian, how this became a lifetime pursuit, what got him interested in the first place, and some of the steps towards coming to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Lonnie.
All right, thank you. I hate talking about myself. The reality is that I became a historian or interested in history for two reasons. One, I grew up in a community where we were the only black family. My grandfather built a house and the community grew up around us. And there were people in that community that treated me fairly and people that treated me horribly. And I wanted to understand why it is. And I realized that history would help me understand what was going on, who those people were. But it was even more than that, was when I was just about 5 years old, my grandfather used to read to me. And one day he was reading a book that had pictures of children that looked like they were my age. And the picture was probably taken in the 1870s, 1880s. And he said to me that these kids that you're looking at have probably lived their lives and died. And when you're a little kid, to see pictures that look like you was very hard to understand. And then he said, you know what? It says underneath this caption that these children were identified. And he said to me, isn't it a shame people can live their lives, die, and just be unidentified? And I became fascinated with looking at photographs to try to figure out what their lives were like. Were their lives happy? Did they have good jobs? Did they marry? How did life shape them? And that just began a lifetime of questioning. And what was so interesting to me is I realized that when I was asked to come back and put together the National Museum, that those memories of my grandfather's reading is what stirred me on. Because the struggle to build a National Museum of African American History and Culture goes back to 1913. 1913, many of you may remember, is the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. And there were these wonderful photographs of old Yankees and old rebels shaking hands, saying the war is over. But there was never any African Americans in those pictures. So African Americans said, we need a presence on the National Mall. And they actually began to raise money. They started to get some space on the mall. And then World War I broke out. No building. Then, in the late 1920s, Calvin Coolidge, yes, you never get to say that name, Calvin Coolidge, as president, decided he wanted to champion building an African American museum. They started to raise money, almost get legislation passed, then the Great Depression hit, so they're 0 for 2. The idea of this floats around time and time again. It floats around after Martin Luther King is assassinated. They can't get a museum built. They really are only fortunate to get a museum built after people began to realize that many of the people who led the civil rights movement in the 1990s were passing from the scene. And it was a desire to capture their history, to capture their stories. And this led to a kind of bipartisan effort to get this museum built. And part of the reason it was successful was that it was bipartisan. Traditionally, when they tried to build a museum, one party dominated. It might have been a Republican Party or a Democratic Party. This is the first time they had Republicans and Democrats coming together. They passed the legislation, and in 2003, George W. Bush signed the legislation. Yes, George W. Bush signed the legislation. And I came back in 2005. Well, let me say how honored Maria and I are to be with you. That this has been an amazing, how many days it's been, but that we've been immersed in this, and it's been absolutely wonderful, and we really appreciate the generosity of everybody here. I think several things hit me as we visited this. First of all, for me, it was a little bit of a homecoming, because many of you know I did work on Mitchellville in the 90s, and it was really amazing now to come back and see, the labels to help you understand the history of Mitchellville, to see the outline of the space. I got really excited about the possibilities. And maybe more than anything else, that's what excited me. After talking to people from different organizations, the excitement and the passion of this community, the desire to tell these stories was something that I don't see in a lot of places. And I came away from the very beginning moved by the possibility of crafting your consortium, your collaboration that allows us to celebrate and expand our notions of Mitchellville or Bluffton or Beaufort, and tell stories that would both engage your visitors but also draw people here to stimulate economic development and heritage tourism. So I think that hit me. And then I think the thing that really got me was, I think I'm touched by everything, but I have to be honest, standing in front of Robert Small's grave and looking to my left and seeing where Harriet Tubman was really moved me, because both of those people are people that I wanted to tell their story in the museum, and I didn't believe we could find material, and yet we now have. If you indulge me to one quick story, I got a call from a collector who said to me, I've got Harriet Tubman material. Now, I'm a 19th century historian. I said, there is no way that there's Harriet Tubman material. There's two little things in a house in Mount Auburn, New York. There's not really any opportunity of this. And the guy who was in Philadelphia said, well, come up and I'll show you. Well, I figured it was a wasted trip, but at least I'll get a Philadelphia cheesesteak out of it. It was worth the trip. I get there, and this man pulls out a box, and he reaches into the box, and he pulls out pictures of Harriet Tubman that no one had ever seen. He's got my attention. Then he pulls out a shawl, and there's a famous picture of Harriet Tubman wrapped in the shawl 3 days before she dies. There's that shawl, and it had been given to Harriet Tubman by Queen Victoria, which was pretty cool. Then he pulls out a hymnal. The hymnal that had all those spirituals that Harriet Tubman would sing when she'd go to help people become free. Swing low, sweet chariot, steal away to Jesus. And by the time he took out that hymnal, I'm crying. And so for me, to be able to stand in front of a site that Harriet Tubman was once at, to then look to my right and see Robert Smalls, it's the kind of thing that I'll never forget.
Why is Gullah Geechee culture, our heritage, important to share with the scope involving the African diaspora?
In some ways, the story of the Gullah Geechee culture is so important on many levels. On the one hand, it's important for a national audience to understand that there's not a single African American experience. That growing up here is different than growing up in the Bronx in the 1970s, or in California in the 1920s, or New Orleans in the 1870s. So one, it's important to help people understand the diversity of this experience. But it's also important because this is an amazing story that talks about connectivity with Africa, connectivity with one's heritage. And it really is a story that helps people understand why it's important to preserve this history, to share and celebrate this history. But also for me, it's important because I would argue that so much of what shaped the early period in American history was rice cultivation, was the work of people in this region, and I think in many ways you could help people understand better how this country evolved and became what it is by looking at the Gullah Geechee culture. And I think the other thing is that because I know you're looking at a corridor from North Carolina all the way to Florida, you really have an opportunity to break away from narrow regionalism and help people understand that, some of our boundaries are artificial. And I think that's an important story as well. And I guess the other reason is, man, this is the best food I ever had in my life.
Lonnie, I'm going to go and do what I like to do best, and that is to sell the museum. And based on my past experience, it don't get fixed without support. And everyone has the brochure in front of them, how to become a member of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Believe you me, because we've done it with other museums, this National Museum knows how to use $25 a year from your member. Right now, you have the special ability to become a charter member of a museum before it is built. There are opportunities, of course, but this museum will represent Gullah, lifeways, culture, history. And I think this is an appropriate segue into, if I give, what will I get out of it? So Lonnie, what does grand opening look like? What am I going to get for my money? What's there for the Gullah Geechee community?
Well, first of all, thank you for the commercial. I appreciate it. I think that it's important to think about this on several levels. On the one hand, I grew up in a little town in New Jersey. They had one gas station, and the gas station had a sign that said, "Cash makes no enemies, let's be friends." So I'm always in search of friends. But the reality is, you don't get a chance to build a national museum every day. You don't get a chance to build a place that says 5 to 7 million people will walk through the doors each year, and 90 to 100 million people will deal with it online. So you have a chance to say, this may be one of the greatest educational opportunities to engage people over issues of race, over issues that have shaped, divided, and ultimately find reconciliation and healing. I think that there is going to be this wonderful, joyous moment when we cut the ribbon. Besides the scream of joy from my family, there will be this sense that this is a place that on the one hand, when we cut the ribbon, and President Obama will cut the ribbon, we will have a parade that marches down the mall. Because one of the things you realize, if you look at African American culture, parades are so crucial, right? Whether it's the marching band from the HBCUs, or the second line from New Orleans, or the fact that so many women's groups used to march in parades to effect change, or obviously the kinds of protest marches that we've seen time and time again. We want to take over that mall and celebrate. What we want to celebrate, though, is not the creation of an institution. What we want to celebrate is the power, the importance of a culture. And we want to honor people like many in this room who have been the pioneers who carry this on. One of the things I want to do is when we open is I want to honor those that carry the flame.
We open it up to the floor.
He's got one right, let's go.
My question to you, and I'm seeking from you maybe an explanation. As you're well aware of the best mayor in America, Mayor Joe Riley in Charleston, is promoting the development of a huge African American history museum in Charleston.
International.
How do you foresee the collaboration between this museum that you're heading up, which I have double enthusiasm as I did for the Martin Luther King Monument, working with the development of the museum in Charleston? Because of anything I've gone around recently and heard different speeches about the rice culture, which has been highly promoted by Jonathan Green, that's another regional thing you're talking about. But exactly how do you envision the collaboration going forward between the Charleston development and your organization?
Well, it's pretty easy for me because what I've said is our goal is to work collaboratively with institutions around the country, not just what's going on in Charleston. But in Charleston, what we do is we do everything quite specifically. As the mayor knows, I have opened doors for him in terms of fundraising. I have worked with him to work with the designers to figure out how to shape what the museum will be. See, my notion is that my job is to let 1,000 flowers bloom. I'm not worried about competition, because that's silly. But what I've done is basically said, by creating this unit that collaborates, is what are the things we can do that work effectively. So this program I mentioned earlier about saving African American treasures, we did it on Penn Center, but we've also done it in Birmingham. We just did it in DC this weekend. And the key is that those programs allow us to collaborate with local museums. So Saving African American Treasures, we basically ask people to bring out their stuff, right? And we help them preserve that wonderful old photograph or that plow. And then what happens is we partner with local museums. So local museums get new visibility, they get new members, and when people want to give things away, we tell them give the local museum first. Now, if it's extremely significant, or in a scholarly parlance, really cool, it's coming back to DC. But on the whole, we try to keep things locally. And things like that allow us to collaborate so that everybody wins. Rather than worry that the Smithsonian's coming to take your collections or take your money, the goal is that our presence makes you better. And we've thought about a variety of programs like that to help. Part of what I think is really important is to help these institutions, whether new institutions like Mayor Riley's or old, to be part of a conversation that really helps people understand where we should focus, how these institutions can really matter and help. Joe Riley's museum, or the museum in Charleston, has several things going for it. It's going to be on sacred ground, where so many of the enslaved people actually landed. I think that Charleston has this amazing history. I think that the key is for people to realize it's not easy to create cultural institutions. And that's one of the challenges. I mean, the example I always cite is Governor Wilder wanted to create a slavery museum in Virginia. That is not going to happen, in part because in order to make a museum, there's an awful lot of planning and thinking that you have to do. It's just because you have a passion, that's not enough. So my goal is to help the institutions who have a passion think about how do you move forward strategically? How do you develop a fundraising plan? What's the kind of staffing plan you ought to do? What is it that makes you of value in your local community? Those are the kind of things I try to help these institutions do.
Once.
Yes?
Good evening, everyone. And Lonnie, I didn't get to say to you earlier, we're glad that 100 day and things like that. So we are. One day you'll learn. But I wanted to ask you this, because I am on the board for the International African American Museum that you were just talking about and that the brother just asked a question about. And I wondered, what would you say has been the 3 best practices that you've learned in this 9-year journey of raising $400 million? What would be the top 3 that you think would be the best practices, so maybe we can emulate some of those?
One is a strong and clear vision. Part of what made this so I was going to say enjoyable, part of what made this work was a vision that said that this is a 2-sided coin. That one side is a story that helps us remember the rich history of the African American experience. A story that helps us as Americans wrestle with our tortured racial past. As John O. Franklin, who was my mentor, used to always whisper in my ear, Lonnie, your job is to tell the unvarnished truth. So I think that's part of it. Then the other side is to take that and say, how do we make sure this is seen as a story for us all? And that 2-sided coin became the kind of vision that really then resonated with corporations. Traditionally when you raise money for these kinds of things, if you can get 17% of your money from corporations, you're lucky. We're going to get 50% of our money from corporations because that idea really resonated. So 1, strong vision. 2 is not moving until you're ready. Really making sure that you've got the people in place, whether it's 2 people or 20 people, that actually can develop the plans you need, follow up, and recognize that if you go early and you're unprepared, it's going to hurt you for many years down the road. And the third piece that I learned is patience. That there were people who I didn't expect to give money, who, because we approached them at the right time, gave a lot of money.
Mm-mm.